I'm Stephen Curran from Ecumenical Scotland. I'll tell you a little bit more about that charity in a minute, but I'm going to talk about Let's Do Net Zero. Now, Let's Do Net Zero is the Scottish Government's commitment to balance off the harm we cause in the environment with good things, so the impact on our carbon footprint becomes net zero by 2045. The UK Government's got a commitment by 2050, but national church denominations have got a commitment this decade to reduce the energy use or change the use of energy, food waste, transport, reduce that harm, but also maybe growing trees, looking after peatland. So the impact is net zero. That's what net zero means. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That's a picture of our annual gathering last year. We had over 100 people involved in Livingston or online. This year it's Stirling Baptist, and I'm delighted that Jess was our keynote speaker. They're so inspiring to talk about local action in the community. And Jamie, I'm great to follow him. Jamie's got a fantastic reputation working with a lot of the churches in Clyde Presbytery, but also more widely across the Church of Scotland. So again, no pressure on me whatsoever in terms of following them. Ecumenical Scotland is an independent environmental charity. We've been on the go for 23 years now, working all across Scotland, and our work's led by volunteers. This is the one thing I want to get across today. The work that's led by volunteers who care about the environment and their church is such an important group for you, whether you are running your local church or you're an organisation trying to support a building or fund local church buildings across the country. And we support churches of all denominations, all different backgrounds, from Shetland down to Wigtonshire, different sizes, different expressions of faith. We've got three aspects to our work. It's about a Scotland that cares and acts for God's creation around spiritual living, practical living and global living. Now, spiritual living means basically supporting and encouraging churches to discover what it means to care for God's creation in prayer, worship and conversation. So it's really about helping the whole congregation to make the link between their Christian faith and environmental concerns. Picture there's of our eco-chaplain, David Coleman, who is an ecumenical chaplain who is there visiting Shapinsay, again an important building in Orkney, with the minister in the Kirk session there, having a discussion about how they can be hopeful and challenging in the way they address environment and climate concerns in relation to their building in Orkney. Practical living, which is really about what we're talking about more today, is about supporting and encouraging churches to put that care into action individually, because we make more damage to the environment ourselves than any church can do, but locally, nationally and globally, desiring to live justly in this transformed world. It's really about taking practical action in our own lives, but more importantly for this discussion today, in the church, through energy, through the use of building, through tackling environmental concerns. Saving money and saving the planet is such a strong motivator, and I think we can all work towards that and supporting each other. And when you've got church grounds where you can do something positive in that as well. And global living is what really motivates people in churches. Climate justice, the sense that people in the global south predominantly who are paying the impact of climate change can't afford it, and they've caused far less damage than those of us who could afford it in this part of the world. That's what gets people motivated around support for Christian Aid, SCIAF and Tear Fund, being able to commit to campaigning on those threats to the web of life in our vulnerable world, but also having a positive impact, working with different environmental justice concerns, but that can also mean influencing policy. One example I've highlighted there is a just transition, trying to make sure those who can least afford it aren't bearing the brunt of the changes to tackle environmental concerns and climate change in Scotland. We enabled communities through the churches last year to be consulted on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Plan for built environment and construction, coming back to today's topic, because there are changes when the church is the most important building in a community where you need to be seen as being valued by other decision makers at different levels of government. We've currently got over 623 congregations registered across the country. That's 1 in 6, getting close to 1 in 5 of all Scotland's churches across any denomination, and that's churches that are registered with us who are committed to environmental activity. That's gone up 14% in the past 3 years, and COP26, you remember, in Glasgow, really galvanised people of faith to do something around the environment through our faith leaders, but also in local churches responding to the need for us to do something in Scotland and in the UK that tackles environmental issues, but also cares for our built heritage as well. But there's a lot of change across churches, and we know that the Presbytery changes in Church of Scotland, some of the Catholic dioceses looking at the number of buildings that they have. Scottish Episcopal Church has been doing a lot in terms of their net zero commitment. The staff like Jack, who you heard earlier briefly, there's a lot of commitment across the the different churches in relation to this. We're encouraging that action in churches through our awards process for Eco Congregation, where the volunteers lead on activity in their church, and it's reflecting that spiritual, practical and global living. And for today's conversation, the action they're taking in the church building to tackle environmental concerns and care for the church building itself and addressing those environmental concerns at the same time. We've got over a third of our current churches have had awards, but recently we've changed the system, and I'd like to see David Bethune here from Selkirk and Ashkirk, who revised their scheme to make it more challenging, particularly around the commitments to make the buildings more sustainable for the future. And we now have 10 have got gold award status where the whole congregation is involved. 2 are here today, representatives from Lomond and again Selkirk and Ashkirk in the Borders, where that particular church is getting everybody in the church interested in tackling the environment and caring about the buildings that they care for as well as important parts of the community. The key thing about this is that our movement is a local environment movement. It's about local environment groups, a green group or an eco group that's based in the church. It's led by volunteers. It's volunteers who care about the environment and their church. So if you're involved in church governance or you're not already involved in our movement, this is a group of people who you could get in your church to be mobilised and motivated to help you with the decisions you need to make around care for your building. If you're a funder or a trust or a community interest company, these are people in your wider community who will be interested in supporting the work you want to do to care for that built heritage and the wider environment in your community. Key partners here are obviously the funders are really important, whether it's local level in terms of giving or big national funders that a whole range of them are here today to listen to that. But other charities, I mentioned obviously the overseas impact of climate justice being a really important motivator. So the international development charities in Scotland like Christian Aid, Scottish Catholic International Aid Fund, Tear Fund, other organisations, and we work collectively through Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, through the Scottish Government's new Climate Policy Engagement Network. So we're listening to that action through the new climate hubs, which are taking place, climate action hubs in different regions of the country, to get local communities organised on tackling climate change through adaptation in terms of how we can cope with the rise in temperatures and the substantially rising water levels that you'll see around the world as well, which has an impact here now in this country. It used to be we would worry about the impact on grandchildren's lives from climate change. Now it's what kind of country, what kind of world do you want to live in next year with the impact of climate change? So get involved with our volunteers, but the other important point I wanted to say is about the denominational link, and I'll finish on this for a couple of minutes. The denominations across Scotland, a lot of them are working together on the net zero commitment to get sure they balance that damage and the good in terms of the impact across all the church buildings and the activities that the churches are responsible for, but they're pulling together through particular focus on net zero. So I reckon nearly 70% of all the church buildings in Scotland that are actively churches are part of that commitment. So over this decade, they are meant to be taking action to reduce that harm, but also to reduce the cost of energy, the type of energy they use, and do something positive about the use of land to help get to that net zero. We've got some really great examples through that. Church of Scotland with their net zero toolkit, which is on, net zero pathway, which is on their website. We've done work through different presbyteries recently where we're organising across those regions of the country. Again, mobilising with Christian Aid, talking about climate justice, getting people out the pews to say this is unfair on people in Africa and Asia who are bearing the brunt of this in the Pacific Islands. But also, what can we do in our own communities, and those volunteers leading on that action. The Scottish Episcopal Church has got a fantastic net zero toolkit on its own website, and that's where the picture's from there, where it's a very simple activity that you can do to get it out of just the property convener, the finance convener, the vestry, or the Kirk session, or the parish council, depending on the way your church is organised, to look at what you can do in a wider group of people focused on how they can care for the building in a way that's more sustainable, and look at how they can care for their wider community. Sometimes being able to engage more widely across that community with the church at the heart of community engagement, not just about the church talking to itself about these problems, but sharing it as a community concern. And the Catholic Bishops' Conference have been doing a real focus on this. So organised a big event in recent weeks where they were looking at encouraging different parishes to engage on this sort of activity. So whether it's Dundee Elam, which is a national denomination with a church in Dundee that's taken action on this, or it can be an independent, separately from any denomination congregation those commitments, we bring all those churches together to share and work, sometimes meeting regionally, sometimes meeting as a national group of churches across our wider network. The last one we had recently was a meeting in Perth, and it brought together the Presbytery of Perth, which stretches from Stirling all the way up to Angus and Dundee, including Perth and Kinross and everywhere in between. And that was dozens of people talking about Christians and climate concerns, the idea that climate justice motivates you, but we can all do something following, whether it's the Net Zero pathway, the Church of Scotland, Net Zero toolkit from the Episcopal Church, or just working through our movement, encouraging people. So please get involved with us. If you're part of our movement, thank you. If you're not, church is not part of our movement, please think about becoming part of it and getting those people mobilised in their community. And if you're a funder or another organisation, that's quite a good group of people to have in your corner fighting for that local church building and making a big difference in all our communities. Thank you very much.